So I'm very grateful to Aubrey Newman and to Quattro Coronati Lodge for this opportunity to think and talk intensively about the early history of Grand Lodge. I don't anticipate we will reach any fixed conclusions. Historical sources are complex objects and don't reveal all their secrets at first reading. Historians constantly revisit and reconsider their sources, asking new questions of them. Much of what we'll discuss today does not concern new factual discoveries, but rather the re-examination of sources that have been familiar for a long time. I hope we'll go away from our discussion with many questions, determined to explore further the newspapers, pamphlets and books that shed light on the early history of Grand Lodge. In the records of Lodge of Antiquity number 2 is a rough book named Book E, which was presented to the lodge by the stationer Charles Stokes, probably in 1721. The Lodge of Antiquity is the successor of the lodge which met at the Goose and Gridiron near St Paul's Cathedral. Many of the records of the Lodge of Antiquity were destroyed or interfered with during William Preston's dispute with Grand Lodge in the 1770s. Some pages have been cut from Book E and copies of minutes inserted. But at the beginning of Book E is a remarkable minute which describes the installation of the Duke of Montague as Grand Master at Stationers' Hall on 24th of June 1721. It has generally been assumed that this minute was inserted in Book E in the 1760s, perhaps by William Preston himself, but this is not the case. The minute in Book E is not in William Preston's handwriting, as I hope you can see here. There are indeed elsewhere in Book E other fabricated extracts from early minutes of the lodge, which were added by someone in the 1760s. But the minute describing Montague's installation is not one of these. The account of the Assembly of Masons at Stationers' Hall in June 1721 was written in Book E shortly after the events it describes. Compare the handwriting with other documents from the 1720s, and you can see that this minute was written in or about 1721. Moreover, the person who copied this minute also inserted in the book a list of members of the lodge in September 1721. As new members joined the lodge, they added their names to the list themselves, demonstrating that this list was inserted in the book in September 1721 and was not a later copy. The minute in Book E is without doubt a contemporary description of the installation of the Duke of Montague as Grand Master. Describing the meeting as a general assembly of a great number of Freemasons, the minute states that the Duke of Montague was installed as Grand Master of Masons and swore on the Bible, quote, to observe and keep inviolate in all time coming the franchises and liberties of the Freemasons and all the records of ancient time in the custody of the Old Lodge of St Paul in London, and was moreover firmly held and bound never to connive at any encroachment of the landmarks of the old lodges in England, or suffer the same to be done by his successors, who shall also be bound by oath to the same. In return, the old lodges surrendered their privileges in trust to a new body, namely the Grand Lodge. This is what the minute says. This day, the Freemasons of London, in the name of themselves and the rest of their brethren in England, vested their separate and distinct rights and powers of congregating in chapter, etc., in the present old London lodges in London in trust, and in the same, this was this day publicly recognised and notified to their brethren in Grand Lodge assembled. The masters of the old lodges accepted the trust for their lodges and were sworn accordingly. Our proposition is very simple. What is described here is the creation of a Grand Lodge. It involved existing lodges giving up their rights in trust to the newly created body. By definition, such a transfer of rights can only occur once. If this transfer occurred in June 1721, then it follows that Grand Lodge cannot have existed earlier. The Antiquity Minute is a contemporary record and is more authoritative than later reports. Moreover, this minute fits in with other evidence that we have. For example, it's long been a matter of surprise that if Freemasonry was rapidly expanding between 1717 and 1720, as we've hitherto thought, there's no mention of it at all in the press. The first reference to the activities of Grand Lodge in the press were the reports of the installation of Montague. Even if Grand Lodge was just a tavern society between 1717 and 1721, we'd expect some documentary traces. The Society of Antiquaries was, at that time, just a group of friends meeting regularly on Friday evenings in pubs in the Strand. But nevertheless, we've got rough minutes from them and references to their meetings in letters. Many of the details of the Antiquity Minute are supported by the contemporary notes of the distinguished antiquary and philosopher William Stukeley. Stukeley described how in January 1721 he was made a Freemason at the Salutation Tavern in Covent Garden. Stukeley also states that he was the first person to be made a Freemason in London for many years, and that it had been difficult to find enough members to perform the ceremony. This is again very surprising if Grand Lodge had already been in operation for 3 years. John Hamill, in his address to Grand Lodge in June, drew our attention to the regulations for Grand Lodge compiled by the civil servant George Payne, which were approved at the same assembly at Stationers' Hall in June 1721. Unfortunately, John confused matters a little by suggesting that they were only to be found in a rare tract from Newcastle known as Book M. But these regulations were first printed in the 1723 Book of Constitutions and then reprinted by William Smith in his Pocket Companion and subsequently in Book M. Although the heading to these regulations in the 1723 Constitutions refers to George Payne as Grand Master, they clearly state that they were approved at Stationers' Hall in June 1721. These regulations, which deserve more attention than they've received, show Payne responding to the surrender of powers by the London lodges by setting out a sophisticated and comprehensive constitution for the administration of Masonic lodges by Grand Lodge. It confirms the procedure described in the Antiquity Minute for the creation of Grand Lodge, and we can see that many of the things described here are comparative innovations. So we propose that Grand Lodge was created through the surrender of powers by the London lodges, the approval of a set of rules drawn up by George Payne, and the installation of the Duke of Montague at Stationers' Hall in June 1721. One objection to this claim is that experience suggests that something like Grand Lodge Freemasonry must have evolved more gradually and could not have appeared suddenly like Athena springing fully armed from the head of Zeus. I should emphasise that we're only talking here about the administrative components of Grand Lodge. Other Masonic developments at that time, such as the development of a 3-degree system, were indeed more gradual and continued after 1721. But Payne's regulations, the founding charter of Grand Lodge, are typical productions of the clubbable world of 18th century London, and the compilation of such rules would have been a simple task for a civil servant like Payne. The speed and enthusiasm with which 18th century clubs and societies could be formed is evident in the creation of the Order of the Bath, another initiative of the Duke of Montague. The Order of the Bath went from tentative ministerial discussions at the end of 1724 to a launch with grand ceremonials in a blaze of publicity in May 1725, a period of about 6 months. During this time, elaborate statutes were drawn up and promulgated, noblemen recruited for the order, and lavish robes designed and produced. Like Grand Lodge, the creation of the Order of the Bath was presented as a revival, and a spurious historical genealogy, also dating back to Athelstan, was created for the knights in a period of just 3 weeks by the antiquary John Anstice. If the Order of the Bath could spring fully armed in 6 months from the head of Anstice at the command of Montague, there's no reason why the Grand Lodge could not have done the same. The traditional story of the creation of Grand Lodge at the behest of 4 lodges who elected Anthony Sayer as the first Grand Master appears for the first time in Anderson's 1738 edition of the Book of Constitutions, published more than 20 years after the event it describes. It's amazing, given the number of pamphlets and books published on Freemasonry between 1721 and 1738, that nobody should previously have mentioned this story before 1738 if there was any basis to it. There's a list of Grand Officers in the first Grand Lodge Minute Book, which begins with Sayer, but this was only compiled between 1731 and 1734, and also reflects a lot of half-remembered stories. Most of the references to supposed early Grand Masters, such as Sayer and Desaguliers, actually also only date from the 1730s. A good example is a letter of the Duke of Richmond referring to Sayer, Payne and Desaguliers as his predecessors, but this is undated and probably comes from the 1730s. All such documents show is that these men were claiming in the 1730s to have been Grand Masters. For all his learning, Anderson was extremely careless. He was incapable of copying out his own text accurately. He invented information to pad out his narrative. The increase in the number of lodges reported by him for 1721 to 2 is suspiciously regular and almost certainly invented, and they conflict with other claims in his own lists. He's not a very reliable source. He wasn't an eyewitness of any of the events he described. The earliest possible date he could have attended Grand Lodge was September 1721. At the end of the 1738 constitutions, Anderson thanks those who'd encouraged him in the production of his book, and only one of these people claimed to have taken part in the events of 1717, Jacob Lamble, a carpenter who was said to have been the first senior Grand Warden at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717. But Lamble isn't a very credible witness for these events. In 1717, Lamble was still only an apprentice carpenter, having taken out indentures in March 1714. He didn't become a freeman of the Carpenters' Company until June 1721. Although Lamble claimed to have been appointed as warden in 1717, there's no further evidence of his involvement with Freemasonry until 1735. At the time he was working on the 1738 constitutions, Anderson was a desperate man. He'd suffered serious financial losses. His Presbyterian congregation in Piccadilly had dismissed him and appointed a new minister. And at the end of 1735, he was confined to the lenient but humiliating rules of the Fleet Prison as a debtor and was never discharged. He tried a number of schemes to raise some cash, and this included work on the 1738 constitutions. Anderson was paid in copy money by the sheet for his work on the book, and it was in his interest, as well as that of his publishers, for him to produce a substantial volume that would sell well. This encouraged him to expand the historical section. Anderson's powerful sense of self-justification often encouraged him to tell white lies. He lied to Grand Lodge when he claimed in 1735 that the Book of Constitutions was his sole property. This is disproved not only by the title page of the 1723 Constitutions, which clearly indicate the copyright lay with the publishers Senex and Hook, but it's also shown by the subsequent history of the sale of the Constitutions, which included the sale and reissue of backstop of the Book of Constitutions without reference to Grand Lodge at all. Perhaps the most striking example of Anderson's unscrupulousness is his interference in the Grand Lodge Minute Book. Anderson claimed he'd been appointed Grand Warden in 1722 or 1723 in the place of one William Hawkins. However, it seems that Anderson only stood in for Hawkins on one occasion and used this afterwards to claim rank as Grand Warden. He altered, as you can see here, the list of officers in the Grand Lodge Minute Book, adding a statement that he'd replaced Hawkins as Warden. Even more shockingly, if we can get on to that, here we are, in the minute of the Grand Lodge for 1723, 24th of June 1723, when Anderson acted as Grand Warden, he scraped out the words "who officiated for William Hawkins" in order to give the impression that he'd been appointed Grand Warden in his own right. And thanks to some wonderful photography by Louise Pilcher of the Library and Museum, you can actually still see, with an enhanced image, those words "who officiated for Mr. William Hawkins" have been scraped out by Anderson. A man who falsifies Grand Lodge records in order to claim a grand rank to which he was not apparently entitled has serious question marks against him as a historian. A committee was appointed by Grand Lodge to vet the 1738 constitutions, but subsequent complaints of errors suggest they didn't do their job very thoroughly. They were also probably more interested in the Masonic regulations than the history section. It's clear from the minutes that Grand Lodge's grasp of its early history was uncertain by the 1730s. But what about people like George Payne or Desaguliers? They'd been intimately involved in the creation of Grand Lodge and were still active in 1738. Wouldn't they have corrected Anderson? The answer seems to be that it was Desaguliers who was encouraging Anderson to lie. This can be demonstrated by Anderson's report of the Duke of Wharton's Grand Mastership. Anderson portrays Wharton's election as Grand Master in 1722 as irregular. He states that Wharton was proclaimed Grand Master by some cronies, that he didn't appoint a deputy, and that the Duke of Montagu had to intervene to appoint Desaguliers as deputy and Anderson himself as Grand Warden. This is, from the beginning, the account of the installation, and that we can find that this is from the beginning to the end a pack of lies because it's contradicted by contemporary newspaper reports. These make it clear that Wharton's election was regular and state that Desaguliers was appointed as Deputy Grand Master in a normal fashion in June 1722. The account in the Book of Constitutions is completely wrong. The reason why Anderson fabricated this section of his history at the behest of Desaguliers is easily guessed. Both Desaguliers and Anderson, as good Calvinists, were anxious to distance themselves from the Duke of Wharton, who'd also accepted a dukedom from the Old Pretender and emerged as a major Jacobite spokesperson in the course of his time as Grand Master in 1724. He was considered by Desaguliers and Anderson a pariah who needed to be airbrushed out of Masonic history. If Anderson was willing to fabricate the early history of Grand Lodge to vindicate Desaguliers, we shouldn't be surprised if he was also willing to take liberties with the narrative elsewhere. Desaguliers had inveigled his way into a lodge in Edinburgh in August 1721 by claiming to be the late General Master of the Mason Lodges in England, an ambiguous phrase which baffled the Secretary of the Scottish Lodge, was intended to indicate some kind of high-level connection with the newly formed Grand Lodge. Desaguliers was keen to have his prestige in Grand Lodge acknowledged, and Anderson's narrative of the revival of Grand Lodge handily accommodated him. But if the story of 1717 was a fib, why wasn't it pointed out at the time? The answer is that Anderson did not state that Grand Lodge was founded in 1717. Anderson claimed that Freemasonry stretched back to Adam. He declares the first 4 Grand Officers were Noah and his 3 sons. For Anderson, the first Grand Master of Masons in England was not Anthony Sayer, but St. Augustine of Canterbury. For 18th century readers, it was these claims which were sensational, and indeed some reviewers of Anderson expressed incredulity at such statements. Likewise, the York rivals of the London Grand Lodge were not interested in what happened in 1717, but in disputing the primacy of the Anglo-Saxon princes Edwin and Athelstan. The story of 1717 was a minor part of Anderson's narrative. He was more interested in biblical chronologies. Just like Anstice with the Order of the Bath, Anderson was anxious to cloak Grand Lodge with a veneer of antiquity, and the story of 1717 provided a link in the chain by which Anderson demonstrated that continuity. Stories circulating in Grand Lodge about figures like Anthony Sayer, who claimed to be a Grand Master in order to strengthen a request for charitable relief, were grist to Anderson's mill in piecing together this narrative. Anderson was also under political pressure. At the time Anderson was compiling the 1738 constitutions, Desaguliers was manoeuvring Grand Lodge into supporting the opposition to Sir Robert Walpole, centred around the figure of the Prince of Wales. This patriot opposition sought to distance itself from the court and stressed continuities with ancient institutions. The story that Grand Lodge was a revival by a group of obscure craftsmen of an ancient English institution suited such a patriot narrative perfectly. The insistence that 1717 marked a landmark in the history of Freemasonry only dates from the 19th century, when Gould and others debunked Anderson's legendary history and drew a sharp distinction between Anderson as a historian and a contemporary source. Even then, there were many warning signs that we should have been cautious about Anderson's narrative. As long ago as 1909, Begerman said that the story of 1717 bears only too clearly the impress of Anderson's luxurious imagination, and insisted that the whole story of the election of the first Grand Master is a myth of Anderson's invention. I think we should